How's it going, everybody? This is Zach, and welcome to this chapter on the circulatory system. In this first video, we're going to be taking into consideration the human heart, and our discussion is going to be centered from an anatomical perspective. So let's begin then by describing what the human heart represents in the broader context of our body. So we know that this whole chapter is going to be based around the circulatory system, and the heart represents a pump at the center of that circulatory system that makes the whole thing operate. This is incredibly important because tissues throughout our body, whether it be the skin on your forearm or the tissue that allows your liver to function properly, all of our body tissues have physiological nutritional needs. And the way that these tissues are going to get this nutrition is via the blood, which is pumped around by the heart. These nutrients can include things like vitamins or resources like glucose, proteins, and lipids, and they can also include gases like oxygen. Now, the first anatomical note that we should make about the heart is that it consists of 4 chambers, with chambers essentially just being muscular compartments of the heart that are capable of holding blood, as well as the ability to contract as they are muscular, which will allow each chamber to pass the blood it holds onto the next location. And so before we move on and dive a little bit deeper into these chambers, it's worth noting that there are 2 main types of chambers, atrium and ventricles, and there is 1 atrium and 1 ventricle for the right side of the heart and 1 atrium and 1 ventricle for the left side of the heart. And therefore, our 4 heart chambers are very simply named the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, and left ventricle. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these. We're going to go ahead and begin with the right atrium. Now, when you think about atria, what I want you to think about are structures that are receiving blood into the heart. Now, when we look to the right atrium in particular, the blood that's going to be being received into the heart is deoxygenated blood, blood that has a low relative oxygen concentration. Now, the question is, why would this blood be deoxygenated? That's because the right side of the heart, the right atrium, and the right ventricle are concerned with taking blood from the body and sending it to the lungs. This is a great setup because the blood that was in the body deposited nutrients and oxygen to the tissues that needed it, like we discussed on the last slide, which means that blood is newly deoxygenated. We gave all our oxygen to the tissue so that they can function properly, and now we sort of need to replenish our oxygen supply in the blood. And that's why we're going to end up sending it to the lungs, where we would bring oxygen in from the atmosphere. So fantastic. We know that atrium are going to be bringing blood into the heart, and that the right atrium is bringing deoxygenated blood in. But one more anatomical note that we can make is that the actual structures that the right atrium is going to be receiving blood from are known as the superior and inferior vena cava. Essentially, what's happening here is that all of the different vessels that are going to be carrying blood from the body tissues back towards the heart are eventually going to congregate into one of these 2 larger vessels called the superior and inferior vena cava. With the superior vena cava, you can think of the merging of the different vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart from the upper part of the body. So the superior vena cava then collects deoxygenated blood from the chest, arms, head, and neck regions. Whereas if you consider the inferior vena cava, you're talking about the merging of blood vessels that are bringing blood back to the heart from the lower part of the body. And so therefore the inferior vena cava would be the structure that's going to be collecting deoxygenated blood from the abdomen, pelvis, and lower limb regions. So at this point, what we have is blood that has deposited its oxygen into the body tissues so they can function properly. It has flowed back towards the heart, eventually entering either the superior or inferior vena cava, finally entering the heart in the right atrium. This means that it is time for us to discuss what happens after the right atrium. For this, we are going to introduce our first valve. Valves are essentially just structures that sit between 2 chambers of the heart, or a chamber of the heart and an artery, and these valves kind of just modulate the flow back and forth. The idea of a valve is to keep blood flowing in one direction. As you can see in the visual below, for the right side of our heart in particular, we kind of have these arrows all flowing in one direction. That's because we have these valves strategically placed here between the right atrium and the right ventricle, which is the next structure we're going to talk about, and between the right ventricle and something called the pulmonary artery, which is something we're going to talk about in just a moment. But what happens is, as the blood is flowing, the valves open so that the blood can flow in the direction that we want, and then after we're done passing the blood along, the valves close so that the blood cannot flow in the other direction that we do not want. And so this first valve that we're discussing that allows blood to flow from the right atrium down into the right ventricle is known as the right atrioventricular valve, otherwise known as the tricuspid valve. And it makes sense that it would be called the atrioventricular or AV valve because it's the valve that sits between the right atrium and ventricle. So now that we have entered the right ventricle, what exactly should we expect to see here? Well, we talked a little bit earlier about how the goal of this right side of the heart is to take in deoxygenated blood from the body and ship it off to the lungs to regain some oxygen. Well, in order to force the blood from the heart to the lungs, we're gonna need a little bit of pressure, and that's where the right ventricle comes into play. The right ventricle is going to squeeze really hard and force that deoxygenated blood into the next structure we alluded to earlier called the pulmonary artery. And it's this pulmonary artery that is the actual vessel responsible for carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. But before we get too carried away, we need to mention our second important valve, and this is known as the pulmonary semilunar valve. Now, the reason that things on this right side of the heart, like the pulmonary artery and pulmonary semilunar valve, start with the word pulmonary is because pulmonary refers to the lungs. And so the pulmonary artery is an artery that brings blood to the lungs, and the pulmonary semilunar valve is the valve that modulates the blood flow from the ventricle into that pulmonary artery. Now, as we started to talk about earlier, the great thing about these valves is that not only are they good for allowing blood to flow from one chamber to the next, but they're incredibly important for preventing blood from flowing in the opposite direction of what we wanted, something that would be called retrograde flow. But something to keep in mind is that we saw two separate valves on the right side of the heart. And so while this right side of the heart is functioning, we need a little bit of coordination between these valves. So to demonstrate this, let's take the process of the right ventricle contracting. To recall, the right ventricle is the structure that receives deoxygenated blood from the right atrium and seeks to pump that blood into the pulmonary artery so that we can eventually get it to the lungs. Now, once this ventricle contracts, the blood is going to want to go anywhere but inside the ventricle. Think about if you had a balloon full of water and you squeeze the balloon, that water is going to come flying out. And so what we need in order to have a successful coordinated right ventricular contraction is for the tricuspid valve, which again sits right between the right atrium and the right ventricle, to be closed to prevent blood from flowing from the right ventricle backwards into the right atrium. And at the same time, we need the pulmonary semilunar valve, which sits between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, to go ahead and open up for us. Therefore, we can empty the blood contents of the ventricle without anything flowing backwards into the right atrium. And then off of that, the next thing to consider is what happens when that right ventricle relaxes and is no longer in a contracting state. Well, in this case, we're going to start thinking about refilling the ventricle with blood from the atrium, and so we're going to need our valves to kind of switch what they're doing. It is at this phase that we actually want the tricuspid or AV valve to be open, and we want the pulmonary semilunar valve to now close so that nothing from the pulmonary artery flows backwards into the right ventricle. If this occurs, then of course we will be able to refill the ventricle from the atrium, and nothing will come back into the ventricle from the pulmonary artery. And so now that we've discussed the entirety of the right side of the heart, we can move over to the left side. And so if the idea of the right side of the heart was to take deoxygenated blood from the tissues and bring it to the lungs for reoxygenation, then the responsibility of the left side of the heart is going to be receiving that newly oxygenated blood from the lungs and sending it out to the body tissue so that we can deposit that oxygen. So we'll begin, of course, then with the left atrium. Remember, atria receive blood, and in this case, it's going to be oxygenated blood that we receive from the lungs via a structure called the pulmonary vein. Again, pulmonary here does refer to the lungs, but in this capacity, we're talking about a vessel that is bringing blood from the lungs back to the heart. And of course, as we mentioned, this is newly oxygenated blood from the lungs. This, of course, brings us to our first valve on the left side of the heart, and it's actually an atrioventricular or AV valve. Again, it's just the left atrioventricular or AV valve. Now, where the AV valve on the right side of the heart was called the tricuspid valve, the AV valve on the left side of the heart is called the bicuspid valve. But the left side actually has an additional third name. It can be called the mitral valve. And for this left AV valve, we are going to expect that this is the valve that's going to allow blood to flow from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So then, of course, we are left to ask, what does the left ventricle do and how does it differ from the right ventricle? Well, something that you'll notice about both of the ventricles is that they are responsible for pumping blood out of the heart. With the right ventricle, we were interested in trying to get that blood to the lungs, but with the left ventricle, we're now interested in taking that oxygenated blood from the lungs and pumping it out to the body. We're going to do this with a structure called the aorta, but something that's important to note here is that the left ventricle is by far the most muscular chamber found within the human heart. And as a result, contractions of the left ventricle are going to generate way more pressure than that of the right ventricle. The simple question here is why? And the answer is because it takes a lot more pressure to push blood out from the heart, which is in your thoracic cavity, out to all of your body tissues than it would to pump it to the lungs, which are actually sitting right next to the heart in the thoracic cavity. But let's talk a little bit more about that structure that receives blood from the left ventricle, the aorta. The aorta acts kind of similarly to the pulmonary artery, but for the left side of the heart. Where the pulmonary artery was responsible for directing deoxygenated blood to the lungs, the aorta is going to take our oxygenated blood and facilitate its passage to the systemic circulation where it can be brought to all of our body tissues. So at this point, we've kind of wrapped up our discussion of the right and left sides of the heart. But before we wrap up with this video, let's take a moment to consider the broader contexts of the pulmonary and systemic circulations. As we mentioned earlier, pulmonary is a term that refers to the lungs. And so therefore, the pulmonary circulation is going to be that part of the circulatory system that involves the lungs. This includes everything from pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs, and then pumping newly oxygenated blood back into the heart. And so let's take a moment to consider the total path that blood takes throughout the pulmonary circulation. We will begin in the right atrium where we collect deoxygenated blood from the body tissues. The tricuspid valve allows that blood to pass from the right atrium into the right ventricle, and the pulmonary semilunar valve allows blood to flow from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery will then carry our deoxygenated blood to the lungs before the pulmonary vein carries it back to the heart where it will enter the left atrium. The other portion of the circulatory system is the systemic circulation. With systemic, we're referring to the entirety of the body, not just one part like the lungs. And so therefore, this is going to be the part of the circulatory system that's concerned with getting oxygenated blood to the tissues for deposition and then returning the newly deoxygenated blood to the heart. Therefore, the circulatory system is going to be concerned with getting oxygenated blood. So let's go ahead and take a moment to consider the total path the blood would take in the systemic circulation as well. We'll begin in the left atrium where newly oxygenated blood is received. The bicuspid or mitral valve or left atrioventricular valve will allow blood to pass from the left atrium into the left ventricle, and the aortic semilunar valve will allow blood to flow from that left ventricle up into the aorta. And as we know, the aorta is going to carry blood to the body tissues, where the oxygen will be deposited into the tissues, and the newly deoxygenated blood will start to flow back towards the heart, eventually entering either the superior or inferior vena cava, which will return the blood back to the heart into the right atrium. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and do a mini quiz to see how you may be asked about these concepts on test day. Which of the following heart valves allows blood to flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle? Go ahead and pause the video now, take a moment, and answer this question. Okay, welcome back. The correct answer in this case is D, the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve, allows blood to flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Answer choice A, the aortic semilunar valve, is on the left side of the heart, and this is going to be the valve that allows blood to flow from the left ventricle into the aorta. The bicuspid or mitral valve is the tricuspid valve's cousin that's on the left side of the heart as well, allowing blood to flow from the left atria into the left ventricle. And the pulmonary semilunar valve is on the right side of the heart, but this is the valve that's going to be concerned with passing blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Okay, this has been the video on the human heart and the first video in the circulatory system chapter. I hope you enjoyed this video and took something away from it. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to